Sure, if anybody would like to join us in the front row, please step on down. Hello everyone, I'm Lydia Malama Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of AIPAD and the Photography Show. Thank you so much for joining us for our opening presentation of our on-site programming with AIPAD Talks this week. We hope you've enjoyed the fair and will continue to do so after. Today I'm thrilled to introduce our 2025 AIPAD Award winners, Havinga and Haas. And they'll, yes. Who will listen to have a conversation with Jean Dykstra, who is also amongst her many accolades, the editor of an outlet close to my heart, AIPAD Exposure. So I'll hand it off to Jean now, and thank you all for being here.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? I want to make sure the microphone's working. Thanks for being here on this beautiful day. First, I want to congratulate Anne and Karen again for receiving the AIPAD Award last night. Yeah, it's amazing. And well-deserved. The two of them have really, over the last 25 plus years, built the wonderful photography collection at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Anne joined the MFA in 1989 and became the Estrelita and Yusuf Karsh Chair of Photography in 2001, which was the same year that Karen joined the museum as the Lane Curator of Photographs. I'm sure many of you here are well aware of the wonderful exhibitions they've curated, but I'm just going to list a few to give you an idea of the scope of those exhibitions. Painted Tintypes, Photography for the People, Ansel Adams in Our Time, with work by contemporary photographers engaging with Adams' legacy, Unfinished Stories, snapshots from the Peter J. Cohen collection, In the Wake, Japanese photographers respond to 3/11, Gordon Parks, Back to Fort Scott, and a show of pictorialist photography that featured F. Hollanday's The Seven Last Words, which the museum acquired in 2013. The MFA was actually one of the earliest museums to collect photography. Alfred Stieglitz donated 27 of his photographs to the museum in 1924, and Georgia O'Keeffe gave an additional 35 photographs in 1950. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how that original donation came to be.
I'm happy to. We have a collection of roughly 75 Stieglitz photographs. Stieglitz gave us the first group in 1924, and it was really the launch of our photography collection as fine art. He was close friends with the museum's curator of Indian art, Ananda Kumaraswamy, who was an amateur photographer who came to New York regularly, and they bonded, and they cooked up the idea of a group of photographs going to the MFA. It started out being, the idea was 12 photographs, and Kumaraswamy had to go to the Board of Trustees to get permission to even consider this. They blessed it, and Stieglitz was so thrilled that he took a year to make the prints, museum quality prints, and he gave us not 12, but 27 photographs. It's really interesting to see which photographs he chose as his most important pictures at that time, because it's not always the pictures you would expect. The photograph on the left of the screen, which is of O'Keeffe's hands, it's one of our greatest Stieglitz photographs. That was in the group. After Stieglitz's death and O'Keeffe was giving out the rest of the estate, of course, a huge chunk went to the National Gallery for the key set, but then she gave designated groups to each museum, and she very carefully crafted another 35 for our museum. And the steerage, which was not part of the first group, but did exist, was in the second group. And we got a wonderful small contact print of that. So we've purchased a few other Stieglitz photographs over the years, but that's the core of our collection. There was a book that Doris Bree did in, I think, 1960. It was a monograph on Stieglitz. It was an exhibition, and she talked about our collection as being the greatest capsule collection of Stieglitz's work. So we're very proud of it. So, and it's launched, you know, Cliff Ackley became curator and he built on starting with that collection, and he chose photographs that related to the Stieglitzes. That's how we started building the photography collection when he came in the 60s.
And it was a real point of pride, too, that wasn't there there's a wonderful letter in our archives, right, about...
There's a wonderful letter. So Stieglitz apparently had hoped that the Met would take a group of his work, and they kept saying no. So then he got our group to happen, and then 2 years later, the Met acquired, 2 years later, the Met acquired group. And he wrote a letter to Coomaraswamy and said, the Met has opened its hallowed halls to photography. Boston helped pave the way. So we have a wonderful letter in our archive. It says a lot about how photography was perceived by art professionals at the time.
Right, right. Well, since that first group, the museum, there's been a couple of really significant acquisitions to the museum. The Lane collection in 2012, with more than 6,000 photographs, including Charles Sheeler's estate, some 2,500 photographs by Edward Weston, and 500 photographs by Ansel Adams. And then in 2018, the Howard Greenberg collection. So maybe you can talk a little bit about those acquisitions, and I thought maybe we could start, Karen, with the Lane collection.
Right. Well, I have had the great good luck to work with the Lane collection and with Sonder Lane since 1995. So I was hired to organize Bill Lane's photographic estate when he passed away in '95. And gradually the collection, I was working at the house with Sonder Lane, and then gradually the collection was moved into the museum over time. And in 2001, as you mentioned, I became the curator at the museum. It's a wonderfully strange, and you just heard the numbers, weird and deep collection. It's an incredible luxury to work with a collection like this and to have worked with a person like Sonder Lane. She was kind of one of our two fairy godmothers of our department and a very important figure, just passed away a little less than 2 years ago. She was a wonderful collaborator, and I'm showing you here a picture of her made in 2012. This is the year that she made the promised gift to the museum to gift the entire collection of photographs. The museum is also the beneficiary of a very large collection of American modernist paintings, prints, and works on paper. The funny thing about this is you see she's sitting with a Weston photograph. This was the first work she bought on her own after Bill's passing, so as a independent collector. And we had to laugh because here she was, of all things, buying yet another Weston photograph. But this is one of the photographs that, in a sense, had gotten away, the picture that got away that Bill had always wanted, but she was not able to acquire. But as many of you know, the whole collection, the Lane collection, really begins with Charles Sheeler. Sheeler was a personal friend of the Lanes and someone they knew as a painter, and didn't realize until his passing in 1965 that he had been making photographs and basing so many of his paintings on those photographs because those had really been suppressed by his dealer, Edith Halpert, at the Downtown Gallery. And so he had put aside all those photographs during his lifetime. And then when he died, his widow approached the Lanes, who were collectors by this time of American modernist works on paper and paintings. And so they went from one day not owning a single photograph to, in 1965, acquiring this entire estate, so everything that was in Charles Sheeler's photographic studio. And so an amazing luxury for us working on that material in Boston. He was an artist. If you know his career, you know that really his eye was completely transformed. The minute he took up photography basically as a day job to pay for his painting, his career as a painter, but his eye was, completely transformed by his work with the camera. And the Lanes, I think, would be described the same way. They were people whose lives were completely changed by the discovery of photography. And they would sit with piles of photographs on their laps and look through and basically teach themselves about photography in their home in Lunenburg, Massachusetts. Bill Lane was a plastics manufacturer, completely self-taught collector of art. And when they decided to buy Sheeler's photographic estate, they didn't know how much to pay per print. And everyone said, think back, 1965, who would you talk to about the price of a print? Well, Ansel Adams. And so Ansel Adams became a very close friend. As some of you may know, he was coming very regularly to Cambridge, Massachusetts to work at Polaroid. The Lanes had a private plane, so they were going back and forth. And here he is in the Lanes house looking at work together. Again, the sort of lapfuls of photographs, which was really their experience from what I understand. And you see in the background works by Dove, African sculpture, et cetera. So a wonderfully eclectic collection. And one of the funny things about working on this collection gradually more and more often in our study room and with Anne and Kristen, all of us together looking at work with Sandra Lane, she had trained to be a school teacher. And so the idea that teaching and education and working with young people was such a huge interest of hers, the study room at the museum was a very important magnet for her, a draw. It made her know that her collection would be very much alive. And we had these wonderful moments where we would put up, we would put out the Westons, and then we would somehow find, the Brigman that she acquired would be in the room, and we'd see how amazing the conversations would be when we put them side by side. And I was just talking to Mitch Epstein, if any of you have seen his print that's in Yancey's booth right now of the same sort of trees. But Sandra always said that Bill would be spinning in his grave to think that she was interested. His collection was very, very narrowly defined by American modernists, Sheeler, Weston, Ansel Adams, Imogen Cunningham, very California-based. When she began to buy works on her own with us and with our advice and coming here to AIPAD and talking to all these amazing dealers, she often would go, as she said, fore and aft. She would look at the artists who were maybe in the same place, but of an earlier generation, et cetera, et cetera. So it was always fun to be able to put things side by side like this and see the relationships. And then when she began to buy 19th century photographs, again with dealers often here at AIPAD, someone who had trained their eye on Charles Sheeler and things like Side of White Barn, would then very naturally, and this became kind of a party game for us, we would go to an auction preview or to a gallery, and we would look at the same works and think, okay, here is Baldus. He made thousands of these images of the Louvre's, the building of the wings of the Louvre in the mid-19th century. Which one will she be drawn to? Well, the one that feels, I think, maybe dearest to her because it is so related to the American modernists that was where she had fallen in love with photography in the first place. So it's been an amazing process. We miss her in the study room, but I think what's great about the collection is that we feel it's very much alive and being looked at every day.
I think all of you know that Howard Greenberg would have an amazing personal collection. The three of us, there was a show of the work that was traveling in Europe, and the three of us, it's not Karen and I, have been at the MFA for a long time, but we also have a third curator, Kristen Gresh, who's here, who's been with us for a number of years now too. And so we went to look at the collection and we thought, oh, that is such a gap in our collection. And so Kristen and I put our heads together and we worked very diligently for several years to try to figure out how we could afford this. And we finally were able to get funding from the Leonian to purchase Howard's collection. This is a collection that has a lot of great classics and really rare prints. I put the list of names on the side, going from lower left is Cartier-Bresson, Kertész, Steichen, Kanaga, and Roy de Carava. They're really special things. The curator of our collection for several decades, Cliff Ackley, was a great curator with a fabulous eye, but he wasn't doing so much with this kind of social documentary, human experience photography. And I'll just tell you, for those of you who know Cliff, is that I brought the catalog of that European show to him. And some of you will know he very deliberately looked at it page by page, and then he stood at the entrance of his office and he would say, and he said, I would go public and say I wasn't doing this and I should have been doing this if you could get this collection. I went, okay. When we worked even harder to see if we could finesse it, and we did, and we are so proud of that collection. And here are some of the great highlights, but I also have to show two of the greatest pictures in the collection. Really, really rare Kappa and a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous Dorothea Lange. Moving
We have a
on,
question, I
who's
think.
next? Oh,
Yeah. Well, this is going off on a slightly different tangent,
Yeah, it is.
but the museum also has significant holdings in fashion and celebrity photography. There was a major Herb Ritz retrospective in 1996, and the museum's first gallery devoted solely to photography is the Herb Ritz Gallery. In 2009, the museum celebrated what would have been Yusuf Karsh's 100th birthday with an exhibition of 100 works. And the Karshes endowed your position, Anne, as well as Kristen Gresh's, and she's the museum's senior curator of photography.
We've had a great relationship with
Yeah.
these two entities, and there was a Karsh exhibition around 1996 too, a smaller one. But our director at that time, Malcolm Rogers, who had just joined the museum, was fascinated by fashion and celebrity photography, and he asked me to pursue it. I came to realize how interesting it was for a photographer to go out into the world and earn his or her living with having to work within parameters. How to make work that was artistic within those parameters and that had a consistent vision, because then you'd become known for your style of work. So that was really interesting. In the early 2000s, I had twins, and they were like 2.5 to 3 years old, and they were going through diaper training, and I was asked to do a fashion photography show. And I had 10 weeks to do the show, and I had, of 100 things that would be in that space, I had 3 in the collection. And so I went to New York a lot, leaving my husband with the diaper training and going to New York and meeting with these amazingly fashionable people and thinking about what was going on at home. And anyway, it was a very exciting show because I learned a lot about fashion photography and really got, and celebrity photography, really got quite hooked on what makes it special. One of our collectors, I was talking to her about it last night, and she said, you know, war photography is also working, and photojournalism is also working within parameters. So we've done interesting things with these two photographers, and we've done interesting things since. The photograph on the left by Helmut Newton was in that fashion photography show. We were able to acquire it. Isn't that an amazing fashion photograph? A few years back, through that show, I got very interested in Hero, who's now passed on, but was alive about 10 years ago when I did a Hero show, and we acquired a first-rate collection of Hero's work that I'm very proud of. And then more recently, we've become interested in Martin Gutierrez, who takes on the fashion photography, celebrity photography in a whole new way. So, and that magazine, Indigenous Woman, is on view right now in our museum. So yes, that's been a run for us.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you both a little bit about your individual careers, because I know that neither of you started out studying photography. So I was wondering if you could talk about if there was a particular photographer or exhibition that made you change direction, or how that happened.
And I'll start first. I was an old master print curator who did my work on Goltzius, the Dutch Mannerist printmaker. And I had jobs in the Philadelphia Museum and the Smith College Museum where I was doing old master prints. I was also interested in 19th century prints, very much so, and that was an extra interest for me. When I was working at the Smith College Museum, there was a collection of 19th century photography that the head curator was not so interested in, but it needed cataloging and work, so that's how I got started. I also had a lot of friends who were photo curators. And then Mac Lee walked in the door with a whole bunch of Cuvelier photographs, and I was smitten. I had already figured out that Smith has 2 very modest photographs that say AC, and that those were Adalbert Cuvelier. And now I learned about this other Cuvelier. These 2 are from the MFA's collection. they're two of my favorite things in the collection, but that got me off and running in photography. So that was really important to me, and because of my interest in 19th century French prints, I got interested in 19th century photography. So that's what led me into the photo world.
Yeah.
Karen,
Right. So I was the oldest living graduate student, I think, in the 1990s. I thought I was going to go into American paintings. I was at Boston University, and only discovered once I got there that there was this whole degree, specialty in the history of photography that I didn't even know was something you could study. You know, I'd studied art history, but no one had ever offered me a course in the history of photography. So very quickly, American paintings sort of drifted away in terms of my interest. And I joke that Robert Frank is was the gateway drug to photography for me. I felt very grateful to be at BU, to have studied with Carl Chiarenza back in the day, and we joke that in Boston, the Boston school painters would say, I studied with someone who studied with Monet, and we used to joke, we studied with someone who studied with Beaumont Newhall, right? That's how old we are. And anyway, it was a wonderful beginning. Fell in love with a photographer, fell in love with history photography at the same time. But it took a while to find a way to make that part of my work life, besides being the oldest living graduate student. But I had a great, I worked at the Boston University Art Gallery. I was the curator there. I was at the Addison Gallery of American Art, where I always like to put in a pitch for that museum because photography is so highly regarded in that setting, and it was a wonderful place to work. And then, as I said, was hired by the museum to work on the Lane collection and have been there ever since. But one of the amazing things that came out of Sandra's passing was we did receive a bequest, and we have a fund to now continue to acquire work with the Lane collection name attached. And it's a huge responsibility. It's very bittersweet. And so there was a lot of thought about what would be the picture that we would buy with that money, the first thing we would acquire. And this is the picture we decided on. Robert Frank was an artist. I remember the day she told me she had bought a Robert Frank, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is not at all what I would expect. And then I saw it was one of his wonderful late 40s pictures made in Paris, very romantic. The chairs, it's now in our show that Kristen organized of Mary's book, Robert Frank, at our museum. But exactly the kind of picture she would love. But she loved this picture, and it's something we talked a lot about. Small town. She grew up in Chelsea, Massachusetts. She was a small town person. She loved this image. And the combination of the world going crazy around us right now and her passing and her love of Robert Frank and my love of Robert Frank, this seemed like the right picture. So we were very excited to acquire it.
That's so nice. Yeah, that's perfect. I wanted to ask the two of you how you work together at the museum. Do you overlap? Do you kind of run on parallel paths? And also, how do the two of you work with Kristen and to sort of cover the field?
That's it.
So as you can see, we already have different interests, started with different interests. And so that's been wonderful. And adding Kristen Gresh to the mix, who had done her dissertation on the family of man. And so I think you can quickly see why the Howard Greenberg collection makes sense for her to be the primary curator for. So we all came with different interests to the collection, but there are only 3 of us, and we got to do more. And we're trying to always stretch and make our collection as broad and interesting as possible. So we've each adopted new areas of the collection. And to looking at the slide, I've been for a long time now working on Japanese photography very closely with our curator of Japanese art. Our museum has the most important collection of Japanese art outside of Japan. And both she and I feel that if we're going to do that, we ought to have a good collection of Japanese photography as well. I want it because Japanese photography is so interesting and is so important in the field of photography, but it's so interesting to see why she wants it. Her collection was founded at the late 19th century, turn of the century, and it sort of slows down then. So she doesn't have that much to express what happened in Japan in the 20th century. And I think you all know that photography is the right medium to tell the story of Japan in the 20th century. So we come at it from these different perspectives, but we're very bonded in trying to push this forward. And we've made some really interesting acquisitions as a result of that. You'll see a slide later. But Karen, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly, so I had a total, you know, I know all of us in the field would agree that so much of our careers, you know, grow out of serendipity, just things that happen by chance. And I had an amazing experience where I was asked to write about a Gordon Parks in the collection. The date didn't seem right. I didn't know where it was made. I couldn't figure out what was going on. So I went to the foundation and I talked to Peter Cunard, and he said the magic words that every curator dreams of hearing, which is, there's a reason you don't know where this, you know, what this is or what the date is, and because this was never, you know, this body of work was never published, and here are all the other prints from that series that no one knows about. And so that led to me working on the Gordon Parks Back to Fort Scott project, which was hugely meaningful for me and very eye-opening just to the importance that stories about Black families, portraits like this one from this series by Parks, this was in the years just before Brown versus Board of Education, sort of looking at segregated education at that period, were hugely important for our community in Boston. And we were very reminded that we were not doing enough to represent our neighbors, the people we were hoping to bring into the museum. And this show was a real turning point for us, and one that made it clear that we needed to do a better job with that. So that's been my particular focus, and that, and also Native American photography, indigenous photography, which is, we now have a curator of Native American art, and or indigenous art, and she and I are working very closely on that.
And then Kristen came to us with, besides her primary interest, also with an interest in Arab world photography and also in Latin American photography. So she pushes that for us. So I think you can see that we're trying to, and it's wonderful that we each have this core interest and now have this interest that we're developing, and that's where we're putting a lot of emphasis in what we're doing for the collection now.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like the Gordon Parks exhibition was, for you, a really significant and sort of a particularly special exhibition. Have there been other exhibitions that have been really meaningful either to you personally or to the museum?
Yeah, I really wanted to mention this Unfinished Stories, the snapshot show that you mentioned in our list of exhibitions, just because it's from the collection of Peter Cohen. Many of you in the audience I know how important Peter has been and his collection has been to all of us wanting to learn more about vernacular material and snapshots in particular. So this was a huge donation. At the time, this was about a decade ago, at the time we had the largest collection from Peter of this material. And Kristen and I did this show in 2015 and really found it very eye-opening. It was really interesting how, you know, history of photography is often told or taught as kind of a march of technologies. And it was so eye-opening to suddenly realize that, you know, we're talking about the Leica camera in the 20s or whatever in the hands of someone like Ilse Bing, but we're often forgetting the whole history of the personal camera, the vernacular. You know, it really opened our eyes in ways that were very exciting. The other thing is that we, the MFA, have become a museum that is very interested in collecting all kinds of paper ephemera. And because we are two separate departments, printed drawings and photographs, but we share a single study room, we look at all real photo postcards. We have a very large collection from the Leonard Lauder's collection of real photo postcards. We look at photomechanical material. We had a curator in the 1890s 1890s, who was bringing together every form of printing at that moment, had worked with Louis Prang and was bringing all kinds of print processes, including a lot of photomechanical processes, into the museum in a big exhibition, I think was 1892. So we are very excited to be thinking about photography more broadly, opening our minds to, you know, if you start with Stieglitz, you could very easily, I think, kind of narrow down, and you can almost imagine exactly the artists who would follow, and many of them are the artists in the Lane collection. What we're so excited about is to be in a position now to be thinking about who, you know, what was the everyday person? What were the photographs? What were, you know, if Gordon Parks was making those photographs in 1950, what was this next door neighbor photographing his family with his personal camera? Those kinds of things have really, I think, made us feel that we tell a more nuanced history.
And a lot of this, stretching the collection in this kind of way, starts with our interest in fashion and celebrity photography back in the mid-90s. That's when we first started to stretch into kinds of photography that weren't always accepted into museums. So
It's such a richer story of the medium when you look at those things, when you include fashion and photojournalism and celebrity and vernacular. It's just a more interesting
we can do more.
picture.
Yeah, and you know, we have a curator of material culture who's working, and you know, we're literally working side by side with. We have someone who's just working on postcards, if you can believe it. And how fun is it to have a class in the study room, and they're looking at photographs, and they look over at this person who's cataloging postcards, and you know, that's exactly, yes, it's very different from, I think, what most people imagine a museum photo department would be. So it makes us better curators.
Yeah. Are there, you talked about the importance of including those kinds of images. Are there particular photographers or genres of photography that you are looking to bring into the collection or do more with?
Oops.
We're having a little trouble with the, sorry.
There.
Yeah, I joke that if you work on a collection like mine and you have Ansel Adams in the mix, there's a period of time, if you work at some place long enough, the director turns to you and says, hey, let's do an Ansel Adams show. And I was determined to have done, we did one in 2005, and it was a wonderful exhibition. You know, very classic Ansel Adams show, but I was determined this time that if we were going to sort of revisit Ansel Adams, we were going to look at him in the context of contemporary artists who were, in some cases, celebrating, but also critiquing his work and coming to the work from a very contemporary angle and considering him as maybe, you know, for his concerns for the environment and climate and all of that. That's, of course, now much more topical, even continues to be topical today. So that was a show that it happened at our museum just before COVID, and then traveled to a number of museums. And I always like to give a shout out to museums, any museum that takes a loan show during COVID. What an amazing experience that was. To think what it's like to install a show on a computer screen, you know, with people who are moving things right and left in a museum all the way on the other side of the country. The patience and all the people that were involved in doing that, it's amazing. Yeah. So I'm really, to have traveled that show during COVID was amazing.
It is.
And I just want to say also, in terms of COVID and the impact it had on our work, at one point while we were all sitting at home, you know, meeting over Zoom, we had a lot of conversations about what shows we would do when we all got back to real life, whatever that is any longer, when we got back to the museum and could work with our collections. And one of the shows that was inspired by our time in our own little spaces and in our little, feeling very contained was my Creative Spaces show I did about studios. It was very exciting for me just to think about how, having watched, in some cases, having taught I was teaching a seminar with David Hilliard, a photographer in Boston, watching young artists being reduced to their kitchen table or the desk that they were working on, suddenly realizing, what is the studio? What does it mean? What does it mean for a photographer today? What was it in the past? And that was a really exciting project. And also during COVID, I don't know if other people had the experience I did, but where we found so much peace and maybe comfort in the natural world, to have been able to work on a show with Barbara Bosworth, a Boston area photographer whose work I have loved for years. We have always admired finally getting to work on her Meadow project,
Yeah, it's beautiful.
which was really exciting for us in this small gallery that we have at the museum, which is the Herpritz Gallery.
Yeah.
It's a small gallery, but it's very centrally located, so we're lucky in that way. When I first came to the museum, I got interested in F. Holland Day because F. Holland Day was from Boston, and the MFA had on loan the photographs that were in the artist's house, which still exists as the Norwood Historical Society, and realizing how important he was in the history of photography, especially at the turn of the century, especially as a counterpoint to Stieglitz, that fascinated me. When Pam Roberts, formerly of the Rhodophotographic Society, worked on an F. Holland Day exhibition, I was involved in that. It traveled to our museum. I added substantially to it, and that led to the acquisition of Day's personal copy of the 7 Last Words of Christ, and believe it or not, we got the crown of thorns that he wore in the making of that picture.
Really?
Yeah, look it up online and you'll see. The thorns are about this long. So that was pretty exciting. And so when I became the lead photography curator, I really tried to, my passion was so great for the 19th century photography that I really tried to build that. And that led to an exhibition that was in 2012 called Silver Salt and Sunlight, which showed some of the best things that we had acquired in that decade. And so that's pretty exciting. And I still, every once in a while, try to get something. I have a few donors who have been generous for that kind of material. More recently, Japanese photography. Working with my colleague and the curator of Japanese art, we did an exhibition that was about the photographic response to the earthquake, tsunami, and Fukushima disaster. It was called In the Wake. It traveled here to New York to the Japan Society. And that was another show that was on a short timeline, but we had a fabulous and very intense time preparing that exhibition. So I wanted to make sure I showed you not only you see Araki's photograph of the clouds. Araki would go on his balcony and make a photograph of the clouds of the sky every day. And after that happened, he scratched out, you can see the date is the date of the event. He scratched out the clouds because life would never be the same after that, after an event like that. And then you can see at the lower left a group of Hatakeyama pictures. You might know that body of work, that his family home, his mother, died in the tsunami, and then he started photographing the family home had been renovated, and he started photographing the tearing down of that community of houses, whatever was remaining, and then the rebuilding of that part of his hometown. And then on the right, you see Lieko Shiga's work, which is more mystical and imaginary about the apocalyptic aspect of what happened on that day.
And we're going to be, aren't we, installing one of the Shigas in our rotunda space very soon, so we're excited to have that out again.
Our biggest acquisition for Japanese photography, I just have to have a minute to tell you that we acquired Kikuji Kawada's archive for his famous photo book, The Map, or Chizu in Japanese. We included a copy of that book in the Wake exhibition because in Japan you can't think about the Fukushima disaster without recalling the Hiroshima disaster. So we wanted to tie that together. He found that was like opening a new life for his work. So he approached us about being the archive of this project. And what is so interesting is that he wanted the archive of the bombing of Hiroshima to be in the US. But we got it, he wanted it to be preserved, and we are very honored to have it. So you can see some examples. We have not only a complete set of the prints and the original book that he offered his wife, inscribed to his wife, but also all his negatives and contact sheets and notes.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Oh, next question.
Well, this goes back, I'm sorry to say, to COVID just a little bit, because, you know, during that period, everybody was so much on their screens all the time. And, you know, it sort of just exacerbated a condition that everybody was in anyway, being on screens all the time. And I just wondered, there's so many different ways now of looking at photography, consuming photography. What do you think in terms of the way you're thinking about presenting photography and kind of the role of a museum in that world? I know it's kind of a big, vague question, but.
Sorry.
I'm not sure if this is completely answering that question, but the slide that you have on the wall is one of these small exhibitions that we have up right now. And it is about Paris as a center of photography. It's a small space that can only show about 20 pictures. And so we have various ways in which Paris is celebrated through photography. The one that will be a little mysterious to you, but most of those you'll know why they're there. But the aerial view, which is by Charles Soulier from the 19th century, was taken from the Louvre, and it shows the Ile de la Cité. And that section of the Ile de la Cité was a place where opticians had their shops. A lot of opticians had their shops. You need opticians at the time to make lenses for cameras. So that's sort of the starting photograph in that body of work.
Yeah.
I think we see photography as a main way that people consume images now. And now, of course, they consume images not only through actual prints, but very much digitally. We feel that museums have to celebrate the actual print and so we still advocate for that as much as possible. Where we're going to end up as people move forward through the digital age, I'm not sure.
Yeah. We actually, I think, had some back and forth about this before we got to this question, because it's a funny moment I think we find ourselves in right now, where it's hard to sort of look into the crystal ball and think what the future is. We've had occasion of late to talk to people about AI-generated images and basically the complete overtaking of our field by everything digital, and realizing that it's hard to know what we will be collecting in the future, what we will be buying. So much of what our role as curators is to protect and care for objects, and to think hundreds of years into the future for future generations. We hope, that this is what we're talking about and thinking about a lot. Anne's France pictures from Paris relate very much to the Robert Frank show that our colleague Kristen put together, that is here on the lower right. And you might want to mention the Leroy. When I said that the Shiga is going up soon, and we've been very lucky, so we're celebrating this wonderful centennial of the 1924 gift, the Stieglitz material. We have, as you enter our museum, there's a rotunda space, Sargent murals up above, and we're so excited to finally have sort of photography at the center of our universe, with many large-scale prints, including this Leroy, which is one of Anne's particular favorite recent acquisitions.
We worked hard to get a Leroy, as Frankel Gallery can tell you. But yes, we are celebrating the centennial of our Stieglitz gift, of the founding of our photography collection as fine art. He gave that gift in 1924, so 2024 was our centennial. That was a great landmark for us. And right now, we have 3 small exhibitions on view. That's a good footprint for us in our building.
Yeah. It's sort of, speaking of how people consume photography and how you might collect it in the future, I was walking around the fair last night with a friend who said, it's so amazing to see these photographs in person that I've only ever seen in a book. And that you get that really special charge from seeing the object itself. It's sort of hard to imagine that we would do away with that.
Yes,
You know?
absolutely. And we often say, you know, having made a particular point to go out and see the Getty exhibition light paper process, and we often say that, you know, part of the reason we've stayed in our jobs as long as we have this deep love for objects, the paper, the materials, the makers. These things really kind of anchor us to our work. We feel so responsible for them. We feel so excited when we can hang them on the wall. We can talk about them with students in our study room. But I think that one of the things that has happened is as we begin to think about, you know, are more and more photographs going to be made simply by prompts to a computer? One of the things we have become very excited, not simply, I shouldn't say simply, as prompts to a computer, one of the things, maybe a backlash to that or a response to that has been, I think we feel a really deep connection to pictures like this Megan Riepenhoff that was in my Ansel Adams show, where we're kind of going back to the very beginnings of our field, literally the materials that make up a photograph, in its very almost sort of simplest, purest sense, and it's very that connection to the object and to the materiality and is really, I think,
And
especially powerful.
Brings us full circle because we are linked with a print department, a very historic and old print department that has always been celebrated for its interest in the cookery, what they always called the cookery of making prints. And we have adopted that approach too.
That's a great phrase.
Yeah.
I've never heard that before.
In print world, they use that word.
Yeah. I think we can open things up to questions if anybody has a question for Anne or Karen.
I guess we've talked so much.
Oh,
Covered
one
so much
question.
territory.
Karen, thank you. When Sandra began collecting for herself or after Bill passed, what kinds of things in addition to the Frank and the Weston did she collect?
Yeah, it was such an eye-opening experience watching her collect, and sometimes we were very involved, and sometimes we were just, kind of trying to keep up. Sometimes we would be riding home on the train after AIPAD, and she'd say, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, I also got this or that," and it was great fun. It was really fun to watch her first be very strict when she was first figuring out where she wanted to go. It was very much, it was something like, as I said, first it was the West End. The next picture was a Hagemeyer, someone who was of that same group, same generation, friend of Edward Weston, but working in a much more soft-focused pictorialist. So she tended to like very romantic. She was buying things like Dridicole. She allowed us to acquire, she gave us the funds to acquire the Sonia Bellotti collection of Sudak. We had no idea that she loved Sudak as much as she did, but then she made that acquisition possible. She was surprisingly, I would say, once she kind of got her, the momentum began, she was surprisingly, I think, forward-looking, but never going so far afield that you would look at a picture and say, oh, this is not a Lane picture. You could always find the connection. You could see the thread. But one thing I'm quite proud about is that, she was collecting things like new topographics. A lot of people don't realize that she had, really incredible, Frank Golke, Joe Deal, Robert Adams. And when she, one of the things about the Lanes collecting, it was very personal. It was often based on personal friendships. So, Ansel and Virginia Adams were the glue that, brought them to California and sort of helped them build that California collection. But then she continued that, and she would say things like, I'm flying out to, visit Robert Adams, or I'm going to England to see Jem Southam. And you'd be like, what? I had no idea. But she felt very strongly that she always wanted, if she could, to know an artist that she was buying work from, and she tried, of course, I probably didn't say anything about the dates, but 65, the whole Lane collection was formed between 65 and 75. So a completely different moment in collecting in terms of prices and the ability to acquire an entire body. You know, they could buy in such depth. It was so exciting. She could not continue to collect that way. That work would not have been possible later on.
The artist on the train, we were like most of the way back, and she turned to us. She said, "I bought this photograph by this artist. His name is Saltzman." I was like, "Oh." I think that was one of the first 19th century photographs that she bought. So
she did, yeah. She realized early on that she was looking at contemporary photography and sort of stunned by the prices, as we all were, and then realized that she could get great 19th century photographs. So she bought, you know, Talbot and Saltzman and Thénard.
And it was at the same time that I was going all gung-ho on 19th century photography for the collection, too. So it was in tandem.
Yeah, so it was exciting. Thank you for asking.
Anybody else?
Lynn? Oh.
Can you talk about how and why the Leonard Lauder collection came to your museum?
You might know better.
Our former director, Malcolm Rogers, befriended Leonard Lauder. And from that led to an interest in, or an offer of the postcard collection, Leonard Lauder's, which was personally collected by him since he was a young kid. And that led to his not only giving the collection, but also endowing a curator. And his title is Curator of Visual Culture, so he does things beyond just the postcard collection. And those postcards, there are so many thousands of photographs, thousands of cards, that they come in phases, and we have a cataloger who just goes through cataloging the Lauder collection. So we are a great resource for postcards, and it's not just photographic postcards, it's postcards of all ilks and types. The first project that the museum did was of Japanese, really beautiful Japanese postcards. It's a broad collection, and it, again, extends us into visual culture in a larger way. Does that answer what you wanted to know? Yeah.
Is your version of Day's 7 Last Words the one that was in the American Museum of Photography in Philadelphia, or did it come from somewhere else? And
That was a different one.
Yeah.
That's the one that I believe Bruce Silverstein might still own, or maybe he sold it by now. Ours is the copy that he kept for himself. And it hasn't, you may know that the one in that show had a painted frame. This is an just plain wood walnut frame. It's in fantastic condition, and we're very proud to own it. It feels to me, it was not always an easy sell to sell that photograph to the administration or to the board or the collections committee, because it was controversial then, and it's still controversial now. The idea of taking pictures of Christ, or posing yourself as Christ and starving yourself so that you would look thinner and all that. I'm very proud of it, because at that time, of course, what could be, if the photographers were trying to prove their medium was an art form, what would be the highest form of art you would try to make your photography be, and wouldn't it be a religious picture, which is in many ways was thought to be the highest form of painting, right, or sculpture. Mm-hmm. So I'm really proud that we have it. And of course, look online, you'll see a picture of the crown. And a few years ago, so we have this small group of Day material, but really choice. A few years ago, we also got one of the Orpheus pictures, so now we have one of the allegorical pictures. And with that, we got Orpheus's lyre. So these props were owned by the Norwood Historical Society, and they still had them. And we are looking after what still remains of their photography collection. They just sold us a few key pieces, but then they gave us these two props. I'm really happy to have a few things. And speaking of Cuvelier and props, when we acquired the second Cuvillier that I showed, which we acquired at the big Cuvillier auction that Denise knows a lot about, Mac Lee, who was the person who discovered that large group of photographs, we went to him, and because those photographs came to New England at the time of Barbizon painting by an amateur Boston banker, amateur artist, who went to Barbizon, bought this huge group of Cuvillier photographs, sent them back to the States, and never opened the crates. And so we have one of the crates. So that's part of the story of Barbizon coming to America, in my view. And Barbizon's influential in America in a lot of different ways, American art in a lot of different ways. So we have a little piece of the transit of that, and that's pretty special too. So.
It's amazing.
Ooh, small holdings, but it is something, so I'm doing Japanese art now, but I'm supposed to be doing Asia. I'm starting with Japan because it feels like it's manageable and important to do, but we need to stretch into China. We only have probably a handful of things. We have like 2 Korean photographers in the collection. There's so much more that we need to do. So yeah, we still have a lot of goals, so we should.
Thank you so, oh, one more question.
First, thank you so much. What is your, I'm curious to know your process for how you find, I'll just say living photographers, and how do they come to you? Are they, I see that Megan here has a work, paired with the Ansel Adams show. What is that process like? And I found it so fascinating that you're mentioning Sandra and how she knew the photographers. And I was wondering if there are people that you're working with now in a similar way who know today's photographers.
Right.
I just never hear about that, but that just might be because I didn't hear about it, but I don't know. So
we have a lot of different ways, as you can imagine, that we work with. We spend a certain amount of time, obviously, meeting and getting to know the people who are teaching in an area. We're very lucky in Boston to have so many great schools and great professors. We then are very interested in doing crits and meeting the students of those teachers, so seeing who they're working with and training for the future, sort of getting a sense of what's coming down the pike. We do one of the things, and you all know this already, but one of the things that I know people in other fields think is so weird, but we all do portfolio reviews all the time, and that is hugely important, critical mass and all the other looking we do at work out there. That really, I think, has got us all, and then coming to fairs like this, where granted, things are already, in a sense, curated for us by the time we get here, but that does help us see. One of the things about portfolio reviews is that if we can get to Chicago or Santa Fe or Portland, Oregon, we're going to see a group of artists that we might not see and might not get to sleepy Boston, or we might not get to see in New York. So we do kind of stretch that way. But when we do shows like the Ansel Adams show, I only had 10 months to organize that show too, and it was a mad dash. Of course, knowing the Ansel Adams material, I have the luxury of having all that material in my building, upstairs, so I can bring it down. I had that to work with. I could then think about things like his famous surf sequence from 1940. I've got those waves in my brain, already. And then when I discover work like Megan's, or I look at her friend Lucas Foglia's work, where he's looking down off the cliff at the waves, I'm just feeling like, all the planets have aligned, and I have found these people that are now my people, and I'm excited to know them and bring them together into a show. So it often is, dependent on an exhibition, or inspired by an exhibition as well.
Yeah, it's true, and we all three, we told you a little bit about the ways in which we cover our collection and our needs for the collection, but we all three do contemporary, but it depends on who's interested in what.
And we have a contemporary department.
And we have a contemporary department that we communicate with. But we also, when we acquire things for the collection, we often think of it, I mentioned at the beginning that we have the Stieglitz photographs, some decades went by, and then there was a curator who was interested in starting to acquire photographs, and he bought things that related to the Stieglitz photographs. So that's how we actually approach building our collection. We often talk about it as a tree. So you have the core of the tree, and every time you're embroidering on a branch, you see something, you think that would be perfect for us because it relates in this many different ways to what we already have, and so it's very usable. When Cliff Ackley was buying photographs in response to the Stieglitz collection, he started by buying other portraits. We had portraits of O'Keeffe, we had a lot of portraits of O'Keeffe, so he's buying other portraits knowing that he could show them, right? He would have something to do with them. So that's how we very much think about how we're going to use the collection when we acquire things, and that's how we think about growing our collection. That's quite wonderful. We rarely start a brand new branch, so.
Thank you so much, Anne and Karen.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.